On today's episode, we're talking about proof, the case studies, artifacts, and references that turn the work you've already done into market-facing evidence of your expertise. We'll walk through the three components of proof, what proof unlocks across your whole agency, and how to actually build it when you feel like you don't have time.
All right, Wook. So the proof is in the pudding. We're talking about the pudding today. So let's start with the narrow view of proof, right? I think when people think, oh yeah, what are your proof assets or whatever, usually people first think of like sales collateral, right? It's like, oh yeah, it's the stuff in a deck that BD puts together, when BD's like, yeah, we got some case studies or whatever that we're going to show during our sales process. That's where a lot of the proof goes. And that's part of it. Case studies are certainly an important part of it, and we'll get to that more. But I think the wider view that we'll get to today is that proof is really the artifact of your expertise. So you got to think about how do you solidify your agency's potency in the market, and you do this by making the work you've already done visible and verifiable. And what are the components that can do this? And when you think about some of these proof assets, so let's say we'll get to the case studies, which is the first component, but agencies see proof assets as a chore, right? Like putting together a case study is a big pain in the butt. But really, I think the right way to think about it is it's an investment in solidifying and institutionalizing their expertise. And the creation, if you really lean into it, the creation of proof assets is valuable in and of itself. So I think that's something to consider.
Yeah, I think it comes time and time again, and we're guilty of this where we would work on really great projects for clients, and then we'd move on because you're on to the next project, and then 6 months later, like you don't remember the specifics enough, but then you're trying to cobble together a case study, and you're just like making things up or not having all the details, and really it's a missed opportunity there.
Yeah. And just to put this in the context of our agency foundation, the framework we've been talking about for positioning agencies, and specifically about positioning, which we talked a lot about in episode 34. When we talk about positioning, it's about what your agency can do. And really proof is the demonstration of it. So, without proof, positioning is in many ways a facade without the backing. So, really have to think about the investment that the proof provides.
Cool. So let's talk about what is proof? Let's define it. And we're saying that there are three components. It's case studies, artifacts, and active references. And all of these together serve the same job to make your expertise visible and verifiable to people that are on your team, but external to people outside of your team as well.
And so, I think what you might find in agencies is that, instead of this kind of, these three components neatly organized, you usually see like a shared Google Drive that, everyone has access to. And yeah, it's basically a graveyard of folders by client name. And, there might be some stuff in it, like a kickoff deck, some project schedules, whatever. But then it only gets touched when someone's like scrambling to put together some slides for a new pitch. And so I think that's a common occurrence in a lot of these agencies.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so let's dive into the first component, so the case studies. So why don't we just start by talking about what does a strong case study look like? We think there are a few things to dive into. So the first is understanding the client's problem and clearly articulating what that problem is. So it's not a case study saying, oh, they needed a new website, but what was a specific situation that the company was in, the client was in, what were the stakes at hand? Was there something breaking that was needed to be fixed, or why did this whole engagement matter to them?
Yeah.
And I think that exercise in itself, just going through and articulating what is the challenge, shows you have some expertise, you understand what a client's problem is, and how you can how you went about solving it.
Yeah, definitely. And so the articulation, super huge. And it is really the setup that everything that follows for it. And so the next thing is the methodology and the process used to solve the problem. And this is about how the agency approached the work. There might be the diagnostic, the decisions that were made, maybe some of the trade-offs that happened during the project, as well as like the exact sequence in which it happened. So this is not like copy pasting your scope of work and just like being like, all right, this is what we did. It's more that there's enough detail that like if another maybe agency peer looked at it, they'd be like, oh yeah, this all makes sense. But then even more importantly, like a prospect is able to follow it and go, oh cool, like this is how they work. And I think getting this methodology and process part right is what separates a case study from a pretty portfolio piece. Because when you think about it, portfolio basically just shows that snapshot of what shipped, but then a case study really goes into how the team did its thinking.
Yeah. And another part is the outcomes and really having some evidence that backs up the outcomes. So typically that could look like, metrics or in some instances, like here's a before after view of how those numbers change or what is the business impact that it had on the client. So, and the more specific you can be is helpful here. So it's like, all right, did you increase conversion rate from 1.8 to like 3.2% in the course of like 90 days? Like, be very specific with the outcomes there. And also, making sure it's tied back to the original problem. So, just sharing numbers is, has no context on its own. But if it can tie it back to the original problem that you're solving to the client, it kind of closes that loop of that story. But at the end of the day, like not all engagements, not all case studies need to have these like numbers to make it be strong. So it's like if you have the numbers, you can lead with it and have that as part of the story. But if you don't, qualitative outcomes also can be very helpful.
Yeah. So
Um,
so those are kind of the three big pieces like we talked about. Articulating the problem, the methodology process, and of course the evidence-based outcomes. So and then there's like these other things that you kind of want to have as elements within the case study that could make it really robust. So obviously there's the visuals, right? Screenshots, before after comps of kind of the what the client had. Maybe if there's a website, especially, it's really powerful there. Dashboard snapshots are good too. Any kind of the artifacts, which we'll get to in the next section, but like artifacts that were part of the process, diagrams, just anything that can like make it easily browsable. There's like a user friendliness that you want with case studies. You just don't want a wall of text. So anything you could break up is great. And then, of course, if you want to level it up, you can also do kind of video testimonials and embed, videos, animation, and other kind of visuals as well. And then there's client quotes, right? And this goes beyond like, oh yeah, this agency did a great job. It's more to the point of like, hey, like these guys really understood the problem. And they helped solve XYZ things, or they were able to really think through XYZ. So it's kind of really, in the client's voice, kind of, talking specifically about what the impact was and what changed. And then, of course, the team context is also worthwhile of like, hey, who worked on what or what kind of roles were involved if you don't want to talk specifically about a team member. But it just kind of gives the prospect who's reading the case study a way to picture what it's like to work with you. And lastly, like the timeline. We always talked about like, hey, part of the process and methodology is kind of showing like, hey, how long did this take? But yeah, what was the timeline of this? And kind of, and this is specifically important in like these kind of high pressure cooker kind of situations where like, hey, client came to us, they need to replatform in like 100 days, and we were able to get it done. And so like being able to tell that as part of the story is another a potential way to spice up that case study.
Yeah, and case studies, it's interesting because like case studies can be used for like a lot of different things. We've been talking about sales as like a big one, right? Where like you're in like that case, that high pressure situation where like client needs to get something done. Awesome. Here's a case study that sales team could use to show, this is exactly what we did for the same kind of client, and you can demonstrate your expertise like in that conversation. But for different teams, so like marketing. So marketing can use the case studies and use it as source materials for blog posts, social content, even like conference talks. And um, I remember, Barrel, one of our agencies, they did a project with this brand, Sweet Lawrence, and there was a partnership that they did with Mattel for the Barbie movie. So that case study turned into an opportunity at this big conference, Expo West, where there's a big panel discussion where the CEO Lucas moderated a conversation with the client on stage, the person from Mattel, and then basically had a whole conversation that stemmed from this one case study example of a engagement that they had with the client. So it can go way beyond just the one artifact that you're creating for your sales team.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah. Yeah, and some other groups. So if you have partnerships, so other partners, agencies, tech partners, etc., who want to understand what you do in more depth, it's good context for them, so that they could also send you referrals. Also, if it lives on your website and it's organized cleanly for AEO or SEO, so prospects can also find you through all the search terms and all the relevant points that are embedded within the case study. And then kind of the last thing to think about is for team members, for team members who weren't specifically working on those engagements, but also new team members that join your team and they want to understand, what does this company do? What have they done? And just get some more context. This is like a great library for them to kind of go through and have that become kind of knowledge that gets institutionalized across the company.
Yeah, and I think what you're getting at with kind of how these case studies are getting used is is starting to view, we mentioned it before, like not a cost but really an investment, and with that it becomes an asset, a clear asset, and that's why we talk about like proof library. Like think about it as a this kind of asset library that you have, and part of what makes a really good library is that, you gotta be able to find things, right? You gotta be able to search it in a way. And so, I think one thing that is important over time is, whether you label it or you put it in different folders or you kind of have kind of some ways to easily access it. You want to be able to organize a lot of these case studies in a few different ways. So, obviously there's like the easy kind of just by client name, which I think most people do it by, but I think you can go further and you can be like, all right, like let's think of it by wedge, right? And then wedge, we defined it in the past as like the specific problem you're solving for the client, and that gets you in the door. And so this could be like, hey, give me some case studies on conversion optimization, or like some kind of e-commerce replatform, or this retention marketing or lifecycle marketing, or like a brand refresh. So you kind of can have it by these kind of different wedges that might have been why you were hired. And then there's also a trigger kind of way to think about case studies, right? A specific situation for the client that made them act and hire you as an agency. So this could be like, hey, maybe it's a specific fundraising round. Maybe this is like, hey, all the case studies for Series B, venture-backed startups, and this is what we did for them. Or anytime there was a CMO switch, because there could be very specific things that happen when a new CMO comes into a brand, and you got to do some work for it. And other things like a forestry platform where you're like, you have only, like a few months before something gets sunset, so you got to help move the client for whatever reason. All those things you can categorize really well. And then the last part is like, just other characteristics of the client or the brand that you might want to group them by, whether they are kind of, they have some kind of type of investor, maybe PE backed or something, whether it's a size, enterprise, mid-market, SMB, multi-unit, multi-brand, different verticals. So just having your library searchable in these ways, or just kind of organized so that your sales, marketing, partnerships, everybody can just kind of access it in a way with that understood, is going to be huge.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest point is like, if it's hard to use, if you don't have the context, like people are just not going to use it, or they're just going to go off and like just have one-off conversations with people one-on-one versus actually using this as like a true library. And stuff like that is getting easier and easier these days. Is it can live in any kind of format where AI can search it, or all these platforms are really good at searching these keywords, but I think the big thing is just having these case studies rich in everything from not just having the process on what you did, but actually including the outcomes on how you impacted the client, and just really having all of the points covered so that when somebody does look up and try to find a case study, it has the full context about what it is that you did for a client.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's move on to the second component, artifacts. So here, you know, a strong artifact is a sanitized piece of the actual work that shows how the agency thinks and operates. And this is different than a case study because a case study might tell the story of how an engagement happened or the outcome, but the artifact is the actual evidence of the agency's craft. And it's something that's going to be a bit more tangible. You can kind of send it over to a prospect and they can kind of poke around, look at it a bit more closely. So it's less about a claim and more about, oh yeah, this is what you guys are doing and producing along the way to the result. And then the in many respects, hopefully it's like useful on its own, right? The artifact might have value to whoever's looking at it before they engage with you. You go, oh, cool. Like if it's a checklist or a diagnostic, it's like, oh wow, this is actually helpful for helping us think about it, and we've seen this with like when you show kind of the intake questionnaire, stuff like that. Some people find that really valuable to kind of take a preview at. And yeah, lastly, like it does, signal depth, right? I think, for a lot of folks, just, living in the slides, it's really hard for the client to wrap their heads around like, all right, is this real? Is this not? And then, so I think having an artifact ready really helps. And some examples I'll just quickly talk about is like roadmap templates, right? Diagnostic frameworks, delivery checklists, audit samples, sample sprints, strategy docs that have been kind of cleaned up a little bit, maybe even tear downs, like just all these kind of deliverables that are produced throughout the engagement.
Yeah, and I think it doesn't have to be like a static document too. Like I know one of our agencies in the sales process, they use like a live artifact where they can like pull up a dashboard and show like performance of a specific client or a sanitized version of it. So they can actually, so the client can see the artifact and what actually happens, and but it's not just a representation of that. But to that point, artifacts can be used, quite a bit in sales, like during that conversation where a client asks like, hey, like what exactly does that look like, or how do you guys actually approach that, and then you can kind of include that as that live demo or those screenshots. The marketing team can use those and turn it into content. So like if there is like a specific diagnostic framework that you use, that could become a blog post, that can become like LinkedIn podcast topic. So like that could live in many different ways where you can share that and show your expertise. Partnerships again, so sharing it with partners and helping explain like what you do better than just having a little deck on exactly your process on how you do it, but actually here's the artifact of what we actually created. And then again, recruiting and onboarding. So when you want to show candidates or people who join your team, like what does the work actually look like, and what do you do? Like there's nothing better than to show the actual artifact of what you made for one of the clients.
Yeah, I like just the point about the partnerships, but it's also on the onboarding side. Like something could be as much the way that like the design team sets up their Figma, let's say for like mobile designs or whatever, and like and design systems, for example. Like if you're working with a partner who might be curious or who might actually have to make use of that's not the good way to solidify the relationship with a partner as well. And then also the partner can then more confidently tell whoever the prospect is that they're kind of referring the agency to be like, hey, look, these guys know what they're doing. They have like a really neat way that they're doing the design system stuff, and like we really trust them to run with this project. And so it just you can see how artifacts work across those dimensions.
Yeah. So I think the key things with the artifacts is try to be as specific as possible and just like share the actual thing versus if it's too sanitized or too like general, like oh here's like what we do, versus like actually showing the thing, like buyers or whoever is the receiving party of it can tell the difference of it. Yeah, and the last thing they think about here is, you know, it's don't be too precious about things. You know, if you're afraid that your competitors will take what you have and then they're going to copy you and then all of that, like there's if someone's going to copy like a checklist that you made, like they're not going to outsell what it is that you're actually selling. So
Yeah, well,
um,
if that's what you're afraid of, you have bigger issues.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right, moving on to component three, so which is the active references, and when you talk about proof, obviously this is very important because when you talk about having a strong active reference, it's definitely a previous client or a current client who's willing to pick up the phone and speak credibly about a specific aspect of working with your agency, and so when we talk about like what is a strong reference, basically they're recent, right? You've talked to this reference in the last quarter. You've been in touch, and they kind of know what's happening in your world as well. They've definitely been briefed, so they know that they're going to be contacted, and what who's going to contact them and what they're likely to be asked. You definitely want to avoid blindsiding a reference and not giving a heads up that they're going to get contacted. And then there's definitely a scoping aspect where like the reference that you're putting in touch with the prospect is kind of matched to a specific claim. So if you have a client that you're trying to more enterprise client that you're trying to do a specific type of project for, you want to match them with another client that has done the similar that you've done similar kind of work for. So this is very important for like kind of an apples to apples experience for that prospect. And lastly, like you want to be certain of the strength, like the advocacy strength of the reference, because not someone who's just willing to vouch, but like someone who's like really really like positive about the experience. Like I think, and just kind of cringe at like kind of recalling some of these like lukewarm references that we might have used in the past, and like they just it was terrible because at the end, like it's like if it's not like if it's not a hell yes, it's basically like a no, right? In the sense of references for a lot of these folks. So you have to make sure they are people who absolutely are love vouching for you and going above and beyond to talk about you in a positive way.
Yeah, I remember with there instances where references hurt us when it was us providing the reference
Oh
person.
God,
It wasn't it didn't go the way that we expected it to go.
real. Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, if you think about references and like how they get used, I think sales is like a big one, right? So usually late in that sales process, you know, when a prospect needs to de-risk and just have some more people that they talk to, you're obviously trying to like match the right concern. If they need to see someone who's done similar kind of company, similar kind of project, whatever it is that is matched to their specific concern and issues, that's where you would bring them in.
Even
But
style, right? Like communication style, because sometimes like people are like, hey, like I don't know if these guys can, kind of match like our kind of need for reporting or just like speed of responses or whatever, right? I think people are kind of trying to look for those things.
yeah, or like location comes up, like, oh, like they're not geographically here. Like, can they, and we can't meet with them in person. Like, is there another client I can talk to that had a similar experience? Like that kind of stuff. But also, if you think about your references in general and like, how do you like maintain that list and like actually keep up to date with your references? Like that process of like reaching out and like talking to your references and seeing like what's going on in their world, updating them about like your business and what's happening, like that could lead to like more opportunities, right? Either with that person or like your reference could then, in their network can refer you to someone else. So that could be a byproduct. And like this could be like, doesn't have to be like a monthly thing. You can do like a quarterly cadence or every 6 months, like enough so that the reference it doesn't feel cold when you reach out asking, hey, like, can you be a reference? So just keeping all of that, your list of people refreshed.
Yeah, no, I love that, and I think just to the point of like a reference leading to another opportunity. I mean, like talk about an asset, right? That's huge because you're not only talking about an extra new business opportunity just by being in touch with your references. That references intro, and they immediately vouch for you, so they're already being a front end reference for you as they make the intro. So like you're gonna get the warmest of intros through the people that are gonna be willing to advocate for you. So I think it's such a valuable asset to cultivate. And so like when you think about like what to avoid with references, I think number one, like just um, having a list of people that you just because they were good clients in the past, or like you had a good you felt they had a good experience, doesn't mean anything. That's actually in many ways they've gone cold. And so it's I think you have to really think about the active piece in active references. And then overusing references is another thing to avoid, because this is why you do need options to kind of select and kind of space out. I remember back in the day we had especially in the early days, we didn't have that many clients and projects we had done. So there were a few that we had a really good reference that we would hit up every couple of weeks for like a new reference. And at some point, they were like, "Hey, like I got a lot of stuff going on. Can we
Yeah.
put a pause on the references for a while?" And like so you gotta kind of make sure not to overuse them. And then of
Yeah.
course, yeah,
Yeah, on that note, like, it's you got to know, like, you can't put so much on their plate, right? You're asking for their time. So it's like, yeah, how can you gotta think your references, you got to treat them right, and try to add value to their lives if they're, supporting you in that way.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, another thing to avoid is like goes along with like the quality of the reference. You don't want them to just talk about you in a generic way of like, oh, they were great to work with, nice guys, or whatever. It's you want it more to be like them to be able to speak to like, hey, they solved this specific problem. They were able to kind of really help us with XYZ. And I think that's where in briefing your references before they take the call, you can highlight some of the things that you think will be important for the prospect to hear. So these are all things that can be prepared for. And then, yeah, the last piece is like it goes along with just the reason why you don't wait to write your case studies, which is you also don't ask for references too late, because at 6 months after a project's closed, and the moment of joy in which you launched something great together has long passed, and you ask for a reference then, it's gonna be less effective. You want to catch them right when they're feeling really great about you and what you guys did together. So definitely hit it at the right moment.
On that note, let's talk again some more about the case study timing. So I think one of the rules here is start drafting the case study during the engagement. While the content is fresh, while the team is still working on it, or like immediately, like right when something ends, so that you have that full context, and don't leave it off until like when we have time, we'll do our case studies, and then you end up not doing it, or you end up doing it 6 months later. Then the reason obvious is like the details of the engagement like really fades. Like if there's like a quote that a client said, or like the numbers that you have to like go back and like reference, or like you could have missed the opportunity to take a screenshot of like the before or after
Yeah.
website, like the things that are obvious, and like you just can't go back and get it.
Yeah, and just a couple little nuances. I guess if it's a purely like project-based engagement, you might want to start in the final 2 weeks, of like trying to draft this thing, and then definitely use that like project close moment to capture a quote and ask for that reference. So kind of stacking some of that as you're working on the case study, and then I think when you do a team debrief, and we talk about this as part of like our agency habits, like most kind of important types of habits is like doing the debrief after an engagement. As you do a debrief, it's really a natural moment to kind of write the case study against the debrief notes that come about. So I think that's really good. And then just on the longer term retainer side of things, just these are unending relationships, but that doesn't mean you can't do case studies. So you can really focus case studies on more specific initiatives, campaigns, and there are projects within these relationships. And so I think when we think about some of our some of the clients in the past. Barrel has done a good job of this for some of their CPG clients like Cabot Creamery or McCormick, where they might talk about produce multiple case studies over the course of the 2-3 years that they're doing it on. It might be about a particular re-platform, or they might roll out some kind of loyalty feature or some kind of gifting feature or international expansion. So like all these things can definitely be talked about so that one logo but multiple case studies. And so yeah, from there I think it just it becomes a more of a habit than one off. And then I think QBRs, quarterly business reviews with a lot of these brands are a great forcing function, because first you have to prepare an internal case study to show the client of like, hey, this is some of the work we did together. And so that recap section of the QBR is basically a draft of the case study. So you can stack some of that together.
Yeah, other things that can make it easier is internally, like building templates. And if there's like a one-page form that team members could fill out that says like here's what happened, or here's some key points, and like it doesn't have to be like this like huge thing that takes an hour or hours to fill, but it could be like anyone on the team, like any like junior team member, senior team member, doesn't matter who takes the first stab, or even like somebody from a marketing team who can take some notes from debriefs, QBRs, like project notes, and they produce like a V1 version of the case study just to get things going.
I mean, let's be real. Like with AI now, you can have your debrief, and then you could have a skill that ingests the transcript and then kind of
Yeah.
outputs. And so your whatever your skill or whatever the prompt might be could have this kind of template embedded to kind of at least produce a first draft. And so yeah, there's ways to make this easy, and it's only going to get easier. But like as with any habit, you have to like take that first step to put this in place.
Yeah. Yeah, a couple more habits to make this easier is you could have like a quarterly proof sprint. So like one day a quarter, you just like catch up on all this stuff, like on indexing and like writing like all the case studies and gathering all the artifacts and like refreshing your website, like whatever the activities that aren't happening consistently. You could get the team really rallied around that in a concentrated amount of time. And kind of the last thing here is, someone has to own it at the end of the day. Like if someone doesn't own it, then it probably won't get done. And that person doesn't have to be like the CEO or the senior person. It could be a marketing coordinator who really it's their job to spend a few hours a week to gather all the inputs, build that library, make sure it's maintained. If you're working with external parties, getting that to them and just making sure that the work gets done.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we've seen this obviously in Barrel, where they started with the design team primarily owning the case study work, and over time it did shift to like a marketing resource. But the fact was someone owned it, and so it always got done. And so that is accountability drives a lot of the results.
Definitely.
Cool. All right. So we covered a lot. I mean, just to recap, the three components of proof is case studies, artifacts, references. So really think about investing in building that library. And remember, write it while it's fresh, create it while it's fresh. Hit up your clients while they're fresh to become references, and then make sure that becomes a habit. And just to kind of reframe it one last time, like proof is really how your expertise shows up in the market. So make the right investments there. So thanks for joining us. Till next time, everyone.